Next are our information items, first being the Gibson Purchasing Payables Follow-Up Audit Update, or Follow-Up Audit, Dr. Dupree, excuse me.
Yes, sir. Mr. Rice, would you like to address the internal audit?
Yes, we have a representative from Gibson Consulting, I believe, who is going to give us an update on the result of the purchasing and accounts payable follow-up audit presentation.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Rice.
I don't think the mic is on. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Rice.
All right,
And thank you,
you.
trustees of Fort Bend and Dr. Dupree for inviting me here today. My name is Ken Ingram. I'm an internal auditor with Gibson Consulting Group. And before I get started, I just wanted to say that at Gibson, we are very excited and happy to be the internal auditors for Fort Bend. A large part of that is due to Fort Bend's view on internal audit, which is one of continuous improvement. That is something that Gibson also believes. We're not here to catch out management on wrongdoings or point fingers or anything like that. We always approach our work with helping Fort Bend employees get better at what they do and be more effective and efficient. My agenda today will be brief. First, I'm going to start with some introductions of the project team, then provide a background of the follow-up audit. Then I'm going to discuss the follow-up audit results. Greg Gibson, who is the president and founder of Gibson Consulting Group, served as the quality assurance partner on this project. He couldn't be here today, but I believe you all are very familiar with Greg. I mentioned myself, Ken Ingram. I served as the lead auditor on the project. Cheyenne Rolfe, who also couldn't be here today, was the project manager. She also serves as the program manager for Fort Bend. So one thing I wanted to highlight before we dive into the details here, a follow-up audit is substantially different from a full initial audit. Really, we're only looking at the implementation status of the items we recommended in the original audit, in this case, the purchasing and accounts payable audit. We get the implementation status from quarterly updates that management makes on our internal audit tracker. And then we do interviews, data analysis, audit testing to develop our own independent assessment of implementation status. The initial audit for accounts payable and purchasing was completed in January 2015. Our follow-up audit started in December 2018 and then concluded in May 2019. As you can see, there were 5 areas addressed in the initial audit. Each of these areas had recommendations for improvement. So we ended up addressing these areas in the follow-up audit as well. Now I'm going to give you an overview of the follow-up audit results and then look individually at implementations by recommendation. Overall, we found that there was substantial and significant progress made in 3 key areas by the purchasing and accounts payable departments. First, there is an increase in contracting efficiency, reducing the amount of time it took to push through a contract, get it approved, and then authorized. We also saw there was an increasing dollar amount that was paid electronically to vendors. This is a much more efficient and accurate method than cutting hard copy checks. Finally, there was a really robust audit program put in place over purchasing card transactions, making sure those are appropriately approved within budgeted amounts, and that was very positive for me to see. However, there are still some areas that can be improved. And we found one kind of major obstacle in this audit was that we learned a lot of very good changes that were made by management, a lot of strong controls put in place, procedural changes. However, these were not always formalized, and there was a lack of audit evidence that we could see to fully mark off recommendations as being completely implemented. I do want to point out that management has agreed with all of our independent assessments and is actively working to fully implement these recommendations. Overall, we decided that 4 recommendations were completely implemented. 1 recommendation was substantially implemented. 4 were partially implemented. And 2 were not assessed, as management did not agree with these recommendations in the initial audit. The pie chart on the graph does not include the non-assessed recommendations. The next 3 slides include a table that shows the recommendation as it was written in our initial report, management's evaluated implementation status, and our independently evaluated status. I'm going to discuss briefly the recommendations that we decided were not completely implemented. The first recommendation I'm going to talk about is A2. And this was really for management to understand what was causing improper contracts and then implement procedures to reduce or eliminate those. So here, an improper contract is one that's been executed after goods or services have already been provided. And we saw here that there were some really good changes made. There was a contract request form put into place, which really helped speed up the process, which reduced the need to push through a contract, maybe not following the procedure you want it to. However, there was no monitoring part of this by management. There was no way for us to come on the back end and see the number of improper contracts that are still out there. So for that, we couldn't definitively say, yes, this has been completely implemented. We did perform audit testing, which showed that our samples were all appropriate. There were no improper contracts in those, which is why we bumped it up to a substantially complete implementation as opposed to a partially complete or not complete. The next recommendation I'm going to discuss is B2. And this was about monitoring blanket purchase orders. So a blanket purchase order is a purchase order that is open and active for a set amount of time. Could be a year, could be 6 months. And they're really good to use if you know you're going to need a lot of an item, but you don't know when the delivery is going to occur, when it's going to be used. And so one good way these are used at Fort Bend is through air filter replacement services. You know you're going to do a lot of them. So this way it's easier to just invoice against this blanket PO and get the services as opposed to having to open a new purchase order every single time. However, in 2015, we saw a lot of instances where blanket purchase orders were used in instances where a regular purchase order would have been better to use. And so management agreed that this is something they need to keep an eye on and track. Present day, management still said there were some departments that were struggling with this and having issues. There were some changes that were made, such as needing a more descriptive request that says kind of why you need a blanket purchase order. However, there was no real monitoring put into place. We couldn't get a grasp or feel for how many blanket purchase orders were out there. And so we couldn't assess whether or not management steps and additional training they provided were effective in reducing and controlling the amount of blanket purchase orders. The next recommendation is C1. This was really about increasing the timeliness of receipt of assets into PeopleSoft, which is the ERP system here at Fort Bend. And we kind of viewed this in 2 separate buckets. One at the warehouse level. We walked through the warehouse, had some good interviews, learned really good controls that they were doing, such as comparing items that were on the floor of the warehouse to what had been received in PeopleSoft to try to highlight things that needed to get processed and moving. However, this wasn't formalized. There was no real audit trail, so we really had no basis of knowing if this actually occurred or not outside of anecdotal evidence. And one thing that was struggling at the campuses for receipt was management never really formalized what's expected to be received at the schools versus what's expected to be received centrally. And so there was a little difficulty there if an item came in that campus officials weren't used to, didn't know how to put into the system that caused a delay. Similarly, vendors would occasionally send items to the school that should have been sent centrally. Accounts payable personnel would have a hard time tracking that down. And so, discussing with management, we decided that they need to formally document what can be received centrally versus what can be received at schools, and then potentially add some language to purchase orders, restricting vendors from sending items to schools that need to go to the central office. Because there wasn't a substantial change really in the receiving function at schools that was causing some of these timeliness issues, and that there wasn't audit evidence at the warehouse level, we said this was partially complete. The next recommendation I'm going to discuss is D1. So this was for management to understand what was causing confirming purchase orders, then implement control procedures to eliminate them. So a confirming purchase order is a purchase order that gets processed after goods or services have already been provided. A kind of a prime example we saw was a teacher individual buying t-shirts and then putting in the requisition after cash has already been paid and t-shirts have been given. Similar to other things, we found that there were some changes made in controls. A really great one was requiring Leadership Council to review a monthly report of confirming purchase orders, which has increased accountability, put the onus on people to chase up and say, why was this done incorrectly? So that was really good to see. What drove our partially complete decision was we did data analytics to see how many confirming purchase orders were still out there using management's report. And we still found a high percentage. I believe it was around 9% of processed and invoiced purchase orders were found to be confirming. And so that drove us to say there have been some changes. They weren't as effective as we wanted them to be, so that led us to say it was partially complete. Finally, the last recommendation I'm going to discuss is E1. This was centered around implementing a performance measure framework that the accounts payable and purchasing department could use to become more efficient, ensure customer satisfaction, etc. Both departments are informally monitoring performance measures. Again, just kind of the last gap there is firming this up, making it a formal process, identifying all the measures you want to have, allocating responsibility for generating these measures, determining how you're going to use them. These were some of the steps that hadn't occurred yet in both departments. So that led us to say it was partially complete. And I'm happy to address any questions the trustees or Dr. Dupree may have.
Thank you Thank you very much for the presentation. Mr. Rice, did you have a question?
I have some comments that I would like to make, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues for questions. And this is really for the audience's benefit as well. Fort Bend ISD has a robust internal audit program. In 2005, the state legislature imposed a duty on the Board of Trustees to be responsible for all audits conducted. And so we've taken that responsibility very seriously, and each year when the audit committee meets, they decide, along with Dr. Dupree, which departments we're going to audit. Some departments are audited annually. For example, we have a financial audit prepared every year that's done by our CPA, and then other departments are audited maybe every 3 to 5 years. But at the end of that audit, once the audit has been completed and presented to the board and accepted, it becomes part of the public domain. And then, but we go further, and then 9 to 12 months following that, we conduct a follow-up audit, which is what this is. And so I want to mention that because it's important to know that we take all of these things very seriously. The administration does, and the Internal Audit Committee. And we have been, for the last 6 years, conducting these audits, which are, in effect, they're efficiency audits. because over time, the district changes. It has grown, and policies and procedures that we used in the past may become outdated. And that's what these audits prove up, because we bring in individuals from different walks of life who have expertise in the various things, and that's how these audits are performed and provided for us. And I would like Mr. Burdine to reserve the right to come back and make some final comments, not questions, on efficiency audits and the new regulation by the state of Texas regarding them. So I'll turn it over to, I believe Mrs. James had hers up first.
Thank you very much, sir. Mrs. James?
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, Mr. Rice. And I'll just say that having been part of the audit committee in the past, I know we've worked really hard on using our audits as a tool for continuous improvement, but also as a way to assess what we're doing well and what we're doing not so well, and what we can start doing and what we should start doing and what we can stop doing. So you're right, that has a lot to do with efficiency in the organization, and there's fiscal impact to that. So thank you for pointing that out. My question has to do with the all of these recommendations, and maybe this is a question for administration. All of these recommendations that were partially complete, are they being, when is the time that we expect them to be complete? Or what's the timeline for implementing these things or finishing this up? I'm not sure who answers that question.
I'll jump in, and Brenda may step in as well. We haven't finalized our time frame for these. We have been working on them. There is a bit of discussion we could have, like on their performance measures per se. I mean, we have some of them have a little bit of a disagreement in terms of if you put 20 measures, and there certainly are 20 measures you could have for purchasing.
Yeah.
But you only want to pay attention to a few, and so we do have KPIs for Brenda's area, and those are the things that we're focusing on. We have those in place now, and so anyway. But as far as the confirming POs, we know that there's more work to do on that. We exchanged some emails with Dr. Dupree in June and earlier this month in terms of what can we do in terms of getting with the vendors, and so hopefully we'll be able to continue to improve on that over the coming year to get that percentage down as low as possible.
Yeah, I could see there was improvement on that, so it looks like you're moving in the right direction. So I was just trying to understand, and I don't know Brenda, you're standing there like you're waiting in line to talk. I don't know if you want to comment or not, but I guess I just don't, I don't know what the right pace is, and so I'm just curious. I mean, obviously things that are, there's some balance.
Let me just also say, though, the thing that's really interesting about this audit is that since this was done, Brenda is the third director, and we've had almost a total turnover of all the key staff. We only have one buyer remaining, from 2015, and we've had total turnover. Two new assistant directors. So anyway, that certainly has inhibited our ability to make the kind of progress that we're used to seeing. But Brenda and her team, as you guys have noticed through the things that you've been seeing, things that we've been catching, and I think you've certainly seen improvement on your end.
And for sure, purchasing is important, and we need to do it right, and we need to be excellent at it. So I understand. So thank you for sharing that. Brendan, do you have comments?
Okay, I just wanted to add that I've set the goal to have these substantially or complete by June 2020. So I'm trying to give myself a year. I'm working with IT right now to produce the reports that will give us the data so that we can see that those things are progressing.
And that's great, because it sounded like some of it is having the data to look at, to know how you're trending, and then having somebody be watching and get on it quicker rather than looking at it a year later and realizing, oh, we didn't do that great. So
working on those tools to measure it.
Thank you. Okay, thanks for sharing.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rosenthal?
Thank you. In looking at some of these items, Which one would you say would, has kind of the greatest risk to the district, at least financially? I mean, have you ranked these, or have we ranked these, or?
I think the one with the potentially greatest risk is the confirming purchase order, because that represents really a breakdown of the standard purchasing process. And that could open the district up to problems if someone buys something from an unapproved vendor, things of that nature, which to management's, I guess, benefit, they've also agreed with that, and that's something that they're focusing on. In my opinion, that's the one that has the greatest possible risk.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mr. Rice, did you want to make some comments?
I just want to make a couple follow-up comments because I want to give a shout out again to Mr. Bassett, who during the last legislative session went to Austin many times and fought for Fort Bend ISD to receive the funding that we're really entitled to. Out of 1,100 districts, there are about 16 that, because of their situation, because of their economically disadvantaged numbers and so forth, did not receive as much money as some of our neighbors did. And Mr. Bassett did his level best to make sure that we did get more. And at the same time, he and his staff were working very hard to get our budget finalized and put together, because we had to vote on that in June. And so when you look at the number of days that the board meets in June, there's a lot that goes into it. And the legislature did not pass House Bill 3 until about 5 p.m. on Memorial Day. So, and I've also, it's come to my attention that Mr. Bassett may have been the only school CFO who went to Austin to talk to the state legislature about this, and all the rest of them stayed home and enjoyed Memorial Day. So I just want everybody to know that we work very, very hard to make sure we can give raises to all of our employees. And when we're giving raises, it's important to know where the revenue is going to come from, because if you don't know and you make decisions in an ignorant manner, you wind up in the red. At the same time, we've put together a budget in which we know in the future we may have to go for a tax referendum. And in order to do that, we have to have an efficiency audit. And the state legislative budget board is the one who determines what the efficiency audit consists of, and they haven't done that yet. And they don't have to do that until January of 2020. So in the meantime, every single audit that we have undertaken for the last 6 years is an efficiency audit of that department. Every single one. And as I said, we've had a very robust internal audit program during that period of time. And once we know what the state intends to do with the efficiency audit, we may hopefully be able to use some of these mini audits that we have conducted over the years. But I just want everybody to know how hard the district has worked to continue to improve processes and procedures as the district has been growing. And we have done this in a very transparent manner and shared every single audit with the public, and just as we're doing now. So hats off to you again, Mr. Bassett, for your yeoman work during the last legislative session. And Mr. Ingram, thank you very much for being here today. I don't think we have any other questions, and we'll see you next time.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Up next, I did want to make one more comment. I wanted to thank Mr. Rice for leading our audit committee. Appreciate your work.